December 1939, RAF Martlesham Heath, on the Suffolk coast. Pilots of No. 264 Squadron walked out to collect the newest fighter in the Royal Air Force. From the front, it looked almost exactly like a Hawker Hurricane. One Rolls-Royce Merlin engine up front, one pilot in the cockpit. Clean lines and a sturdy, wide undercarriage. It looked like a machine you could trust in a fight. Then you walked around the tail, and the illusion broke. Sitting just behind the pilot was a large powered turret, a metal drum bristling with 4 machine guns. And when a pilot climbed in and looked along the nose for a gun sight, there was nothing there. The Bolton Paul Defiant carried no forward-firing guns at all. Every gun it owned was in that turret behind the pilot, aimed and fired by a second man the pilot could barely see. For a fighter pilot, this was almost impossible to accept. The oldest instinct in air combat is simple: point the nose at the enemy and fire. In the Defiant, that instinct was useless. The pilot flew the aircraft. Somebody else did the shooting. The whole idea rested on a theory about how the next war in the air would be fought, and that theory was about to be tested against the Messerschmitt 109. One senior armaments officer had already put his worry in writing. He doubted whether the Defiant could even catch and attack a bomber flying at 230 miles per hour under real operational conditions. He suggested that the machine might be fit only for use at night. At the time, this sounded like caution. Within a year, it would sound like prophecy. Within months, Defiant crews were dying in numbers that horrified Fighter Command. On a single July afternoon in 1940, one whole squadron of these aircraft was cut apart in a matter of minutes. Gunners discovered that when their aircraft was falling, they could barely climb out of the turret in time, and a fighter with no gun in front simply could not fight the enemy machine that was hunting it. By the end of that summer, the Royal Air Force pulled the Defiant out of daylight combat altogether. The turret fighter looked like one of the worst mistakes British aviation had ever made. Then something strange happened. A year later, in the darkness over England during the winter of 1940 to 1941, the same aircraft went back to war. It was painted black now, hunting German bombers in the night sky above London and the industrial cities. And in that role, for a short and vital window of the war, the machine that had been mocked in daylight became one of the most effective night fighters Britain possessed. It is one of the strangest reversals in the whole history of air warfare. Before the war, the Royal Air Force had believed in the turret fighter so deeply that there were plans for it to form a large part of the fighter defense of Britain. Then the summer of 1940 tore that faith to pieces in a matter of weeks. And then, in the dark months that followed, the discredited machine quietly earned a second reputation that was almost the mirror image of its first. This is the story of how a fighter dismissed as useless in the sun became a genuine killer in the dark. It is also the story of something less comfortable. It is the story of how much of the Defiant's reputation, the glory and the shame alike, was built on numbers that were never true. To understand why the Defiant went so wrong, you have to start not with the aircraft, but with the idea behind it. The original sin of the Defiant was not a weak engine or a cracked spar. It was a doctrine. In the middle of the 1930s, the Royal Air Force was trying to solve a specific problem. Planners believed that in a future war, the great danger would be fleets of enemy bombers coming to attack Britain. Crucially, they believed those bombers would arrive without fighter escort. The reasoning seemed sound. Germany was far away. No single-seat fighter of that era had the range to escort bombers all the way to Britain and fight over the target and then fly home. So the bombers, it was assumed, would come alone. There was a deeper fear underneath all of this. In the years after the First World War, many people in Britain had become convinced that the bomber was an almost unstoppable weapon. Stanley Baldwin, a man who had already been Prime Minister twice and would hold the office again, had famously warned the House of Commons that the bomber would always get through, that no defense could keep enemy aircraft from reaching their targets, and that the only real protection lay in striking back even harder. A whole generation of planners grew up believing the next war would open with a knockout blow from the air. great fleets of bombers smashing the cities in the first days. If that was the future, then Britain needed the most efficient bomber destroyer it could possibly build, and the turret fighter, with all its firepower gathered into one concentrated arc, looked like exactly that. The Defiant was born out of a genuine terror, not out of foolishness. If the bombers came alone, then a defending fighter did not need to dogfight enemy fighters, it only needed to destroy bombers. And bomber destruction, the theory went, was a job of steady aiming and concentrated fire, not of twisting and turning. So why not build a fighter that split the work? Let the pilot concentrate entirely on flying the aircraft into the perfect position. Give a second crewman a powered turret, so he could aim and fire in almost any direction, while the pilot held the machine steady. A turret fighter could slide up alongside a bomber or underneath it and pour fire into it from an angle no fixed gunfighter could hold. This was written into an Air Ministry requirement in June 1935, a specification known as F935. It asked for a two-seat day and night fighter with all of its armament in a power-operated turret, and with performance close to the new single-seat monoplanes then coming into being. Several firms answered. In the end, the contest came down to two, and only one truly pursued it. That firm was Boulton Paul Aircraft. The idea was not entirely new. A generation earlier, in the First World War, the two-seat Bristol fighter had shown that a machine with a pilot in front and a separate gunner behind could hold its own in a scrap. In the 1930s, the Royal Air Force had already flown turret-armed two-seaters such as the Hawker Demon, so a modern all-metal monoplane built entirely around a power turret felt less like a wild gamble and more like the natural next step in a family of ideas. Among the firms that answered the requirement were Armstrong Whitworth, Bristol, Supermarine and Hawker. Hawker offered a turret fighter called the Hotspur, but the company was already straining to build the Hurricane and quietly let its turret design fall away. That left Boulton Paul almost alone. The Defiant became the nation's turret fighter as much by default as by any clear victory in competition. Boulton Paul was not a famous name like Supermarine or Hawker, but it had become Britain's great specialist in one thing above all, the gun turret. The company had built turret-armed aircraft before, and had acquired the rights to an advanced electrically and hydraulically powered turret, designed by a French engineer named de Boisson. Boulton Paul developed that into its own Type A turret, a smooth rotating drum carrying 4 Browning machine guns of 303-inch caliber. The chief designer, John Dudley North, was one of the most inventive and least celebrated aircraft engineers in Britain. He wrapped a clean, modern monoplane fighter around that turret and called it the P-82. The turret itself was a genuine piece of cleverness, and it is worth pausing on, because it is the whole point of the aircraft. The gunner sat inside a rotating cupola driven by an electric and hydraulic system. He could swing the 4 guns around in a wide arc and elevate them well above the horizontal, tracking a target smoothly while the pilot flew straight ahead. 4 rifle-caliber machine guns firing together threw out a heavy stream of bullets, more concentrated than the fixed pair or 4 that many fighters of the early 1930s had carried. In theory, a single well-placed burst from below could rake the length of a bomber's fuselage. The problem was never the turret. The problem was everything the turret forced the rest of the aircraft to become. On paper, it still looked elegant. The prototype, serial K8310, first flew on August 11, 1937, at that stage without its turret fitted. It handled well. It looked the part. An order for 87 aircraft was placed even before the prototype flew. Such was the confidence in the concept. The Royal Air Force believed it had found a war winner, yet the Defiant was slow to arrive. Fitting and perfecting the complicated turret took far longer than anyone had promised. The first true production machine did not fly until the end of July 1939, and deliveries to that first squadron only began that December, with the war already begun. By the time the turret fighter finally reached the front line, the careful assumptions it had been built on were only months away from meeting the reality of modern air combat. The trouble was hiding inside the beautiful idea. To carry a heavy-powered turret and a second man and all his ammunition, the Defiant had to be big and it had to be heavy. It used the same Rolls-Royce Merlin 3 engine as the early Hurricane and Spitfire, producing around 1,030 horsepower. But it had to haul far more weight on that same power. The turret and the gunner and the structure needed to support them made the Defiant roughly 1,500 pounds heavier than a Hurricane flying on the very same engine. That weight had to be paid for somewhere, and it was paid for in speed and in agility. The Defiant reached about 304 miles per hour at 17,000 feet. The Messerschmitt 109E, the fighter it would actually meet in battle, was faster by something close to 40 miles per hour, and far more nimble. The Defiant climbed more slowly. It turned more heavily. It was a large, honest, stable machine trying to survive in a world of small, vicious, quick ones. And then there was the flaw that no amount of engineering could fix, because it was not an engineering flaw at all. The Defiant had no forward-firing guns. If an enemy sat in front of it, the crew could do nothing. If an enemy dived on it from below, where the turret guns could not easily depress, the crew could do nothing. The whole survival of the aircraft depended on the enemy politely presenting himself in the turret's field of fire. Against unescorted bombers flying straight and level, that might work. Against a single-seat fighter flown by a man who understood the Defiant's blind spots, it was a death sentence. Britain was not the only nation to try this. The Fleet Air Arm ordered a naval turret fighter from the same stable, the Blackburn Rock, which shared the Defiant's 4-gun turret and its lack of forward guns. The Rock proved even more of a disappointment, so slow it could barely catch the aircraft it was meant to destroy. Germany, by contrast, never built a turret fighter at all. The whole concept was a peculiarly British answer to a peculiarly British fear, and only Britain paid the price of finding out whether it worked. The most senior skeptic of all was the head of Fighter Command himself, Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding. Dowding fought hard against plans to fill a large part of his fighter force with turret aircraft. He regarded the concept as close to obsolete before it had even proved itself. He wanted Hurricanes and Spitfires, machines that pointed their guns where the pilot pointed the nose. History would side with Dowding, but first, thousands of young men would have to fly the theory into combat and find out the hard way. And for a few dazzling days in the spring of 1940, it looked as though the theory might be right after all. Before the disaster came a false dawn, and it was so bright that it fixed the Defiant's legend for a generation. In the middle of May 1940, as the German army stormed across France and the Low Countries, No. 264 Squadron flew into action for the first time. Its first victory came on May 12, 1940, a Junkers 88, brought down near the Dutch coast. Then, over the beaches of Dunkirk, where the British Army was fighting to escape encirclement, the squadron found the moment that would define it. Under squadron leader Philip Hunter, the crews worked out a way to make the turret pay. They flew in a tight, descending circle, each aircraft guarding the tail of the one ahead, so that any German who tried to attack ran into the massed fire of several turrets at once. For a few brilliant days, it seemed to work beautifully. On May 29, 1940, in 2 patrols over Dunkirk, the squadron claimed an astonishing 37 enemy aircraft shot down. One crew alone, Flight Lieutenant Nicholas Cook, and his gunner, Corporal Albert Lippett, claimed 8 of them in a single day, among the first men in the war to be credited as aces in one action. Cook told a reporter that it was like knocking apples off a tree. The newspapers seized on it. Here at last, they said, was the turret fighter proving the doctrine right, cutting down the Luftwaffe wholesale. Across the whole Dunkirk period, the squadron's running total of claims climbed toward 6 aircraft and beyond. For one shining moment, the Defiant was not a mistake. It was a triumph, splashed across the front pages of a frightened country desperate for good news. We will return to those numbers later, because they matter enormously, and because almost none of them were what they seemed. But in June 1940, nobody knew that. All anyone saw was a British fighter that appeared to be winning, The reckoning came on July 19, 1940, in the skies off the Kent coast, and it was so brutal that it earned a grim nickname that has never left the story of this aircraft. It became known as the Slaughter of the Innocents. The victims were the men of No. 141 Squadron, the second unit to fly the Defiant. Their commanding officer had few illusions about the machine. He is said to have regarded it as a death trap, and he had not adopted the careful defensive tactics that the 1st Defiant Squadron had worked out over Dunkirk. On that July day, 9 of his Defiants flew a patrol south of Folkestone. Above them, waiting in the sun, sat the fighters of the 3rd Group of Fighter Wing 51, one of the most experienced Messerschmitt units in the Luftwaffe. The Germans dived out of the glare. They came from behind and below, exactly where the Defiant was helpless. There was no gun sight in the nose to answer them, and no turret angle to reach them cleanly. In a few minutes it was over. 6 of the 9 Defiants were shot down almost at once. A 7th was so badly damaged that it too was lost. 10 British airmen were killed or went missing into the Channel. The squadron was effectively destroyed as a fighting unit in its first real action. Only the arrival of Hurricanes from another squadron prevented every single Defiant from being wiped out. The German pilots who did the killing were among the finest in the Luftwaffe, and several of that day's victories were credited to men who would rise to command in the fighter arm. For No. 141 Squadron, there was nothing left to do but count the dead and pull back. Within 2 days, the shattered survivors were withdrawn to Scotland, far from the fighting, their brief and catastrophic career as a daylight fighting unit already finished. Why did it happen so completely? The answer was written into the aircraft the moment the doctrine was chosen. The Defiant was slower than the fighter attacking it, so it could not run. It could not turn tightly enough to escape, so it could not evade. It had no forward guns, so it could not counterattack. And its one weapon, the turret, was blind to an enemy sitting below and ahead. Once German pilots understood all of that, and they learned it very quickly, the Defiant became less a fighter than a target that happened to carry guns. The disaster of July was not an isolated accident, it was a pattern. Late in August 1940, the 1st Defiant Squadron, No. 264, the very unit that had triumphed over Dunkirk, was thrown back into the daylight battle over southeast England, and it too was torn apart. Across 3 terrible days, it lost around 11 aircraft, 5 pilots, and 9 air gunners. On August 24, 1940, the squadron's own commanding officer was lost. Squadron leader Philip Hunter, the charismatic leader who had done more than anyone to make the Defiant work, chased a German bomber out over the sea in aircraft N1535 and never came back. His gunner, pilot officer Frederick King, died with him. Hunter was 27 years old. In just a few months of daylight fighting, the Defiant had killed a great many of its own crews. It had proved that a fighter which cannot shoot forward cannot survive against fighters that can. The theory of the unescorted bomber, the idea that the whole design rested upon, had collapsed. The German bombers had come with escorts after all, and those escorts had made short work of the turret fighter. All of this was happening in the middle of the greatest air battle Britain had ever fought. Through that summer of 1940, the Hurricanes and Spitfires of Fighter Command were locked in the daily struggle that would be remembered forever as the Battle of Britain, beating back the German effort to win control of the sky before a possible invasion. The Defiant squadrons had been thrown into that same battle and had been found wanting. Every turret fighter shot down was a crew that could not be spared, and an aircraft that had achieved less than a Hurricane would have achieved in its place. That was the hard arithmetic that finally drove the type out of the daylight sky. There was a third danger in the Defiant, quieter than the guns of the Messerschmitts, but just as deadly, and it fell almost entirely on one man in the crew. It was the problem of getting out. When a single-seat fighter is doomed, the pilot rolls the aircraft, drops out of the cockpit, and pulls his ripcord. It is terrifying, but it is fast. For the gunner of a Defiant, it was nothing like that simple. He sat inside a powered turret ringed by guns and structure. To escape, He generally had to rotate the turret to one side, roughly 90 degrees off the line of the aircraft, so that he could open a way out and climb clear. In a machine that was spinning, or burning, or breaking apart, those extra seconds were the difference between living and dying. There was not even room in the turret for a normal parachute pack worn on the back or under the seat. Instead, the gunners wore a special all-in-one garment with the parachute and life jacket built into it, worn tight against the body. The men nicknamed it the Rhino suit. They disliked it, but there was no alternative, because unlike a bomber, the Defiant simply had nowhere to stow a chute within easy reach. The result was that the men in the back died at a rate that haunted the squadrons. A pilot might survive a crash that killed his gunner. Sometimes a pilot landed a shot up Defiant, only to discover the man behind him was already dead in the turret, cut down without the pilot even knowing. On the squadron's proudest early day over Dunkirk, its single fatal casualty was a gunner, leading aircraftman Evan Jones, whose turret was hit. He managed to get out over the channel but drowned in the water, and his body was later found near the French coast. The turret fighter carried a cost that never appeared in the performance charts, and the men in the back paid most of it. By the autumn of 1940, the case against the Defiant seemed complete. Set it beside the aircraft it was supposed to stand alongside, and the verdict was merciless. A Spitfire of that period weighed around 6,400 pounds loaded and could reach roughly 360 miles per hour. The Defiant weighed something like 8,300 pounds loaded on a weaker engine and struggled to reach 304. The Spitfire and Hurricane pointed 8 guns wherever the pilot pointed the nose. The Defiant pointed 4 guns wherever the enemy happened not to be. It was slower than its friends and slower than its enemies. It was heavier than both. It could not shoot where a fighter most needs to shoot. Its gunners could barely escape it, and it had just cost the lives of some of the finest young men in fighter command for very little in return. Dowding withdrew it from daylight operations. On the evidence of the summer of 1940, the sensible thing to do with the Bolton Paul Defiant was to admit the mistake and move on. The case for writing it off entirely seemed overwhelming, and yet one line from that early armaments report refused to die: the suggestion that the Defiant might be fit only for use at night. At first, that had sounded like an insult, a polite way of saying the aircraft was no good. But as the summer of 1940 turned into autumn, the war itself changed shape, and that supposed insult began to look like an escape route. The men who saw it were not famous test pilots making grand speeches. They were the crews who had survived the daylight slaughter and who understood, better than anyone alive, what their strange machine could and could not do. Think again about the turret and the doctrine behind it. In daylight, against nimble fighters, the turret was a fatal handicap. But the whole reason the turret had been built was to attack bombers from angles a fixed gunfighter could not hold, and especially from below. In the chaos of a daylight dogfight, that idea had been exposed as a fantasy. But at night, against a lone bomber that could not see you coming and had no escort to protect it, that same idea suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. A Defiant could slide into the darkness beneath a German bomber, matching its speed, sitting in its blind spot. The pilot did not need to aim at all. He simply held station below and slightly to one side. Then the gunner, looking up, could fire his 4 guns straight into the belly and the wing tanks of the bomber above. There was no need for the difficult deflection shooting that fixed gunfighters struggled with in the dark. It was, in effect, an upward-firing ambush from directly beneath the target. Years later, the Germans themselves would fit upward-firing guns to their own night fighters and use exactly this geometry to devastating effect. The Defiant had stumbled toward the idea first, almost by accident, because its whole design forced it to fight from below. The war handed the Defiant its second chance in the form of the Blitz. The Luftwaffe had tried and failed to win command of the daylight sky over Britain. Its bombers had proved terribly vulnerable to hurricanes and Spitfires by day. So in the autumn of 1940 the Germans changed their method. They turned to bombing British cities by night, when the day fighters that had beaten them could scarcely find a target at all. The scale of what followed is hard to overstate. Night after night through that winter, wave upon wave of German bombers droned over London, and then over Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham, Plymouth, and the other great cities and ports. They dropped high explosive and incendiaries into the blacked-out streets below. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed. Whole districts burned, and the defenders discovered, to their alarm, that they had almost no effective way to stop bombers in the dark. The anti-aircraft guns fired blindly into the night. The Spitfires and Hurricanes that had won the daylight battle were nearly helpless once the sun went down. They were single-seat machines with no radar and no second pair of eyes, and a bomber that slipped below the nose simply vanished into the black. Britain needed night fighters, and it needed them at once. It needed aircraft with 2 crewmen, so one man could search while the other flew. It needed machines steady enough to stalk a bomber patiently through the darkness. Suddenly, the very features that had doomed the Defiant in daylight, its second crewman, its heavy stability, its turret built to fire upward into a bomber, were exactly the things a night fighter wanted most. The aircraft had not changed at all. The war had changed around it, and it now fitted a role that nobody had designed it for. So the decision was made. The Defiant would not be scrapped. It would be sent into the dark, and the transformation from daylight failure to night hunter came quickly. The aircraft were repainted, their undersides and then their whole surfaces finished in matte black to hide them in the night sky. Flame-damping shrouds were fitted over the exhausts so that the glow of the engine would neither give the crew away nor ruin their night vision. Most important of all, the newer Defiants began to receive something the daylight version had never carried: airborne interception radar, an early set mounted inside the aircraft that let the crew find a bomber in the dark once the ground had steered them close. A radar-equipped night fighter version entered service, and a more powerful Mark followed it, fitted with the stronger Merlin 20 engine that lifted the top speed to around 313 miles per hour and gave the heavy machine a little more life in the climb. The number of squadrons tells the story of the reprieve all on its own. As a daylight fighter, the Defiant had equipped just 2 frontline squadrons, and both had been mauled almost to destruction. As a night fighter, it would in time equip around 13 squadrons in all, though never anything like that many at once. Among them was one flown by exiled Polish airman, number 307, the only Polish night fighter squadron of the entire war, who took as their badge a fierce night hunting owl. That squadron had formed in the late summer of 1940 and worked up through the hard winter that followed. Its crews drew first blood in the middle of March 1941, when one of them caught a Heinkel bomber in the darkness over the northwest of England. Proof that men who had lost their own country could make the awkward British turret fighter bite. A machine that had been pulled out of the daylight war in disgrace was now being handed a share in the whole night defense of Britain. The useless fighter was quietly becoming a hunter. Now, before we follow the Defiant into the night skies over the Blitz, and before we reach the uncomfortable truth about the numbers on both sides, take 1 second to subscribe. It genuinely costs you nothing, and it helps this channel keep making deep, carefully researched aviation history like this. With that done, let us climb into the dark. The night-fighting Defiant that emerged from all these changes was a very different proposition from the doomed daylight version, even though the airframe underneath was almost the same. Picture it now. A large black aircraft, all but invisible against the night, its exhaust flames hooded. 2 men inside. Up front, a pilot flying on instruments and on the calm voice of a controller in his headphones. Behind him, a gunner with his 4 Browning guns, waiting for the moment when the pilot would slide the machine into position beneath an unsuspecting bomber. The Merlin 20 in the later marks gave it just enough performance to climb to the bomber's height and stay with them. The radar set, crude and short, ranged by later standards, let the crew close the final gap in darkness when the naked eye alone would have lost the target. And the turret, that great liability of the daylight battle, was reborn as the perfect night weapon. 4 guns that could be walked steadily along the length of a bomber from below while the pilot did nothing more than hold a gentle formation with his victim. Everything that had made the Defiant a poor daylight fighter mattered less in the dark. It did not need to outturn a Messerschmitt, because there were no Messerschmitts escorting the bombers at night. It did not need blistering speed, because a heavily loaded bomber was slower than it was. It did not need forward guns, because its whole method was to attack from beneath. For the first time since it had entered service, the Defiant was being asked to do the one job its strange shape was actually suited for, and it was about to prove that the crews who had defended it were right. The first successes in the dark came in the autumn of 1940. Sources differ on the exact date of the very first confirmed night kill, and any honest account has to admit as much. But by the middle of September 1940, Defiant crews were beginning to bring down German bombers under the cover of darkness. One early victim came down on a housing estate, a Heinkel bomber destroyed in the night by a machine that only weeks earlier had been written off as a failure. These were not easy victories. Night interception in 1940 was slow, cold and frustrating work, far more like hunting than like the swirling dogfights of the day. A crew might climb into the freezing dark and fly for hours and see nothing at all. The pilot flew blind on his dim instruments, while the gunner strained his eyes at the blackness, and the whole crew depended on a chain of men on the ground whom they never saw. But the successes grew, slowly, and with them grew something the Defiant crews had not felt in the daylight summer, the sense that their aircraft was finally on the winning side of the exchange. In those first weeks, many of the crews had no radar at all, and hunted by eye alone, guided only by the sweep of searchlights and the glow of the fires burning below them. It was desperate, hit-and-miss work, and a kill owed as much to luck as to skill. But even a handful of successes mattered enormously, because they proved that the idea itself was sound. A turret fighter really could creep in beneath a bomber in the dark and tear it open. Once that much was certain, the effort to fit the Defiants with radar and to build a whole control system around them was worth every hour it took. The reason for that growing success was not the Defiant alone, it was a system, and the aircraft was only one part of it. Understanding that system is the key to understanding both the Defiant's real achievement and, later, the myth that was built on top of it. It worked like this. On the ground, radar stations and observers tracked the incoming German bombers and passed the plots back to a control room. There, controllers built a moving picture of where the enemy was and where the defending night fighters were. A controller would then speak to a Defiant crew by radio and steer them through the darkness, calling out headings and heights, guiding the fighter toward a bomber the crew still could not see. This was ground-controlled interception, the patient business of vectoring a blind hunter toward its prey across miles of empty night. As the fighter closed in, the airborne radar carried in the later Defiants took over the final stage. The set could detect the bomber ahead at short range and guide the crew closer still, until at last one of them caught a glimpse of a darker shape against the night, or the faint blue flare of exhausts. Then came the Defiant's speciality. The pilot eased the black fighter into position below the bomber, matched its speed, and held there in the enemy's blind spot, and the gunner fired upward into the belly of the machine above. One flight, one controller, one radar set, one turret, all working as a single chain. It was the chain, not any one link in it, that was starting to kill bombers. For the two men in the aircraft, it was a strange and lonely kind of warfare. Much of a patrol was spent in silence and cold. The only signs of life, the crackle of the controller's voice in the headphones and the faint glow of the instruments. Then would come the word that a target was near, and the whole machine would seem to tense. The gunner would strain his eyes into the dark for the shape he had been promised. The pilot would ease back the throttle and hold his height, and for a few short seconds, the long, empty hours would collapse into a single chance. Miss it, and the bomber was gone again into the night. Hold it, and 4 guns would speak at once. The night roll also changed the bond between the two men who flew the Defiant. In the daylight, disasters, the gunner had too often been a passenger to his own death, unable to touch the fight that killed him. In the dark, he came fully into his own, finding the target and destroying it, depended utterly on his eyes and his aim in the final seconds. Pilot and gunner became a true team, each almost helpless without the other, and the crews who flew together longest learned to work in the dark almost without words. The peak of that struggle came in the spring of 1941, as the Blitz rose to its most ferocious pitch just before it ended. Across the winter and into that spring, Britain's night defences had been improving slowly and painfully. The figures for the whole of the night fighter force show the change plainly. In March 1941, the defenders destroyed around 22 German aircraft at night. In April, the total roughly doubled. And in the terrible, brilliant nights of May 1941, the night fighters and the guns together brought down close to 100 raiders in a single month. It is important to be honest about those totals, because they belong to the whole system and not to the Defiant by itself. Much of that rising score was being run up by a new and far superior machine coming into its own, a twin-engined fighter we will meet properly in a moment. But the Defiant was part of that defense at its most desperate hour. In the earlier stretch of the night Blitz, when the better machine was still scarce and its radar still immature, the Defiant carried a real share of the burden. For a short window it was, by the crude measure of squadrons in the line and bombers brought down, among the most productive night fighters Britain possessed. Some crews became genuine night hunters. One of the finest was a pilot nicknamed Hawkeye, Flying Officer Frederick Hughes, flying with his gunner, Sergeant Fred Gash, in a Defiant of No. 264 Squadron. The two men had first drawn blood in daylight, claiming a pair of German bombers on a single August day in 1940. Then they carried their partnership into the dark. They downed a Heinkel one night in the middle of October 1940, and went on adding to their tally through the winter, including a bomber destroyed in the night over the counties south of London in the spring of 1941, a machine that aviation historians would dig from the English earth long after the war was over. Hughes eventually left the Defiant behind, converted to the newer twin-engined night fighters, and finished the war as a squadron commander with a score well into the double figures. Another celebrated pairing, Sergeant Edward Thorne and his gunner Sergeant Fred Barker, became the most successful Defiant crew of all. Most of their victories were won in the desperate daylight fighting, but they crowned their record with a night kill in 1941. These were ordinary men, sergeants and junior officers rather than famous names, and they turned a mocked and awkward aircraft into a real weapon by nothing more than skill, nerve, and patience. And here we have to stop and turn the whole story around, because the temptation now is to declare the Defiant a hidden hero, a misunderstood war winner cheated of its glory. The honest history will not allow that, and refusing to face the numbers would be its own kind of lie. Return first to that dazzling afternoon over Dunkirk, the 37 aircraft claimed on May 29, 1940, and the tally that climbed toward 6 across the days that followed. Those numbers were not real. They were claims, made in good faith by frightened men in a swirling battle, and the very design of the aircraft made them almost impossible to get right. Several gunners, each with a wide arc of fire, would often pour bullets into the same twisting German machine, and each of them would report it honestly as his own kill. Modern historians who have set these claims against the surviving German loss records reach a far smaller figure. Across the entire Dunkirk period, not just that one celebrated day, the Defiants probably destroyed something in the range of 12 to perhaps 20 German aircraft, against claims that eventually ran to 6 and more. The proudest day in the aircraft's history is, in cold fact, a record of what men believed they had shot down, not of what actually fell. And the losses were painfully real, even when the victories were not. Over Dunkirk, the squadron gave up 14 of its own Defiants. The popular tale attached to Dunkirk is just as shaky as the score. The story goes that German fighter pilots mistook the Defiant for a Hurricane and attacked it from behind, straight into the waiting turret guns, and were slaughtered for their error. It is a wonderful story. There is no solid German evidence that it happened in any systematic way, and most of what the squadron claimed that day were bombers and twin-engined machines rather than the single-seat fighters the legend describes. It belongs to folklore, not to history. The Knight reputation needs exactly the same honest handling. The line you will read again and again is that the Defiant shot down more enemy aircraft than any other type during the Winter Blitz. That single sentence has been copied from book to book for decades. It traces back to one author's summary, and other respected historians have quietly pushed against it, pointing out that the Defiant produced rather few victories for the very many hours its crews spent in the air. The rising night scores of the spring of 1941 were driven above all by the radar-equipped twin-engined fighters and the maturing control system behind them, not by the Defiant. The defensible truth is narrow and specific. For a limited early stretch of the night, Blitz, when it fielded the most squadrons and the better machine was still rare, the Defiant was probably the leading night fighter type in service. That is a genuine distinction, and the crews earned it. It is simply not the same thing as being the great bomber killer of the whole campaign. Even the crew's own claims in the dark carried some inflation. Careful comparison with the surviving German records shows that they still reported more kills than the enemy actually lost, though the gap was far smaller than the wild overcounting of the daylight battles. Night combat was a cleaner kind of accounting than the swirling chaos of the day. It was never quite an honest one. There is one more honest thing to say about how the Blitz ended, because the night fighters did not win it single-handed. The Great Assault faded in the late spring of 1941, above all because Adolf Hitler was turning east. He was massing his air force for the invasion of the Soviet Union, and bomber unit after bomber unit was pulled away from the war against Britain and sent to the new front. The strengthening night defenses, the Defiant among them, made the raids costlier and helped force the change of method. But it was the German decision to attack Russia, more than any British fighter, that lifted the weight of the Blitz from Britain's cities. So the numbers demand context, and the context does not destroy the Defiant. It rescues it, but as something more modest and far more honest than a wonder weapon. The overclaiming was never a lie. It was the natural product of terrified young men fighting through violent, chaotic seconds, several of them firing at the same target, none of them able to follow it down to the ground while staying alive themselves. Strip the myths away, and a real achievement still remains underneath. In the summer of 1940, the Defiant was a bad daylight fighter that cost far too many lives, and nothing can ever change that. But in the autumn and winter that followed, at the single most dangerous moment in Britain's night war, the country needed any machine at all that could carry 2 men and 4 guns and a hope of finding a bomber in the dark, and the Defiant was there in numbers when almost nothing better existed. It bought time, it held part of the line while the true answer to the night bomber was still being built. A stopgap that works when nothing else can is not a failure. It is very nearly the most valuable thing a hard-pressed air force can have. That true answer arrived in the shape of the aircraft that would soon make the Defiant obsolete, and setting the two side by side shows exactly where the turret fighter really stood. The machine that inherited the night was the Bristol Beaufighter. It was everything the Defiant was not. It had 2 engines, so it was fast and could carry a heavy load. It carried its own airborne radar as standard equipment, and instead of 4 rifle-caliber guns crammed into a turret, it aimed 4 20mm cannons straight ahead, a weight of fire that could tear a bomber apart in a single firing pass. It scored its first radar-guided night kill in November 1940, and through the following spring it took over the night war almost completely. On the worst night of the whole Blitz, in the middle of May 1941, radar-equipped Beaufighters destroyed well over a dozen bombers in a single night, a haul the little Defiant could never have dreamed of matching. Against the Beaufighter, the Defiant had no future at all, and everyone knew it. The turret fighter was a bridge to this machine, not a rival to it. Before the Beaufighter, there had been the Bristol Blenheim, pressed into the night role early. The Blenheim earned a permanent place in history as the first aircraft ever to destroy an enemy at night using airborne radar, in the summer of 1940. But it was a converted light bomber, too slow and too lightly armed to be a real answer, and it soon faded from the front line. Set beside the Blenheim, The Defiant's steadier gun platform and its 4-gun turret had genuine merit in the earliest fumbling months of night defense. And then there were the single-seat day fighters, the Hurricane and the Spitfire, sent up on so-called fighter nights to patrol the dark. They had been the heroes of the daylight summer, and they were nearly helpless once it ended. One man could not fly on instruments and search the black sky and aim his guns all at the same time, and without radar he was reduced to hoping he stumbled across a bomber caught in a searchlight beam. Here the Defiant's second crewman and its patient turret gave it a clear edge. In the dark, 2 pairs of eyes and a dedicated gunner beat a lone pilot squinting over his own nose. The wider judgment of history on the turret fighter as an idea is blunt. No nation ever built a truly successful one, and after the Defiant and the Rock, nobody seriously tried again. The concept died because the thing it had been built to fight, the slow, unescorted bomber droning in alone, turned out to be a fantasy, and because a fighter that cannot shoot where it is pointed simply gives away too much. The future belonged to exactly the machines the Defiant was not. Fast single-seaters with forward guns owned the daylight, and heavy radar carrying twin-engined hunters owned the night. The Defiant sat in the narrow ground between those two worlds, too specialized for the first and too quickly outclassed in the second. The human cost of all this fell, as it had from the very beginning, most heavily on particular men. The daylight battle had been a massacre of Defiant crews, and the gunners suffered worst of all because of that cruel escape problem in the turret. The names run right through the story. Squadron leader Philip Hunter and his gunner Frederick King lost chasing a bomber out to sea. Flight Lieutenant Nicholas Cook and his gunner Albert Lippett, the celebrated pair who had claimed 8 enemy aircraft in a single Dunkirk day and who were themselves killed only days afterward. The 10 airmen of the shattered squadron off Folkestone. Across the whole daylight career of the type, dozens of aircrew died, and a grimly large share of them were the men in the turret, killed simply because they could not climb out in time. The gunner's seat in a Defiant was among the most dangerous places to sit in the whole of fighter command. And the deadliest threat to a Defiant crew was never the German bomber the aircraft had been built to destroy. It was the German fighter the aircraft could not fight, and again, it was the machine beneath them that would not let the gunner go. By the middle of 1942, the Defiant's frontline career was over. The Beaufighter and the superb new Mosquito had taken the night for good, and the turret fighter was withdrawn from the interception squadrons. But the aircraft did not simply vanish. It found a third life, quieter and almost wholly forgotten, and in some ways it was the most useful life of the 3. Most of the surviving Defiants were turned into target tugs. With the turret removed and a winch fitted in its place, they trailed long fabric drogues across the sky so that gunners, on the ground and in the air, could practice shooting at something that actually moved. A dedicated target towing version was built in quantity, and hundreds of older airframes were converted to the same role by outside firms. In this humble work, the Defiant became the most widely used British target tug of the war, toiling on far from the headlines, training the men who would do their fighting in other aircraft. It served not only at home but overseas, in the Middle East, in Africa and in India, and a handful even soldiered on into the years just after the war ended. Others were fitted out for air-sea rescue, carrying dinghies and survival gear out over the water to search for downed airmen, so that a machine which had drowned its own gunner early in the war now helped pull other men from the sea. Strangest and most secret of all was the Defiant's career in electronic warfare. A specialist squadron, number 515, flew modified Defiants packed with jamming equipment, aimed squarely at the German radar network. The unit had grown out of a small special duties flight and became a full squadron in the autumn of 1942. One of its systems could catch the pulses of a German early warning radar and throw them back so cunningly that a mere handful of aircraft would appear on the enemy screens as a great fleet of bombers, a ghost armada conjured out of empty air. Another system simply drowned the German radar in electronic noise, tearing a gap perhaps 200 miles wide in the enemy's coverage through which real bombers could slip unseen. The squadron flew a spoofing operation to help cover the Great Raid on Dieppe in August 1942 and began its jamming missions in earnest that December. The turret fighter that had failed so badly at pointing guns forward ended its operational life as a weapon that fired no guns at all, blinding the enemy with invisible signals. It flew its last such missions in the summer of 1943. There is one final, almost poetic chapter. After its flying days were over, the Defiant helped to save the lives of future pilots. Some airframes were used in the pioneering trials of the ejection seat, the device that would one day fire aircrew clear of a stricken jet in an instant. The aircraft whose gunners had once struggled so desperately to escape their turrets became a testbed for the technology that would make bailing out survivable at last. Around 1064, Defiants of every version were built. Almost all of them were scrapped once their work was done, unloved and unmourned, and for many years it seemed that not one complete example would survive anywhere in the world, but one did. A single Defiant, serial N1671, survives to this day. It was one of the earlier production machines, taken onto the strength of the Royal Air Force in the summer of 1940, and it served with that Polish night fighter squadron before passing to other units. For decades it stood on display near London. Then, after a long and painstaking restoration carried out by dedicated volunteers over many thousands of hours, it was moved to the Royal Air Force Museum at Cosford, only a short distance from the Wolverhampton factory where it had been built. Fittingly, it now stands near the recovered wing of a German Dornier bomber raised from the sea, one of the very types the Defiants hunted in the summer of 1940. The hunter and the hunted, side by side at last. What, then, are we to make of the Boulton Paul Defiant? The two neat legends both collapse. It was not the plucky wonder weapon of the Dunkirk headlines, and it was not simply the useless death trap of the daylight summer either. The truth is stranger and far more interesting than either. It was born from an idea that turned out to be wrong, the belief that bombers would always come alone, and it paid for that error in the blood of its crews the moment the escorts arrived. Its most glorious day was a mirage of honest overcounting. Its most repeated boast, that it downed more night raiders than any other, shrinks under a careful eye to a narrower and quieter truth about one desperate season. And its gunners carried a burden of danger that the men who dreamed up the turret fighter never had to face themselves. Yet inside all of that, something real was done. When Britain was blind in the dark, and the bombers were burning her cities, and the better machines had not yet arrived in numbers, this awkward, heavy, ridiculed aircraft climbed into the night and brought some of them down, and it held part of the line until the true night fighters came. The Defiant's real story is not the tale of a secret champion robbed of its due. It is the far more human tale of a mistake that was handed a second chance by the sheer accidents of war, and of the crews who took that flawed machine into the darkness and made it matter for exactly as long as their country needed it to. British planners did not design the fighter they actually needed. They designed the wrong one, and then, for one dark winter, they found a use for it anyway. That is the truth worth carrying away about the turret fighter that failed in the sun and hunted in the dark.